Riley Mason wasn't the kind of woman who looked for trouble. In fact, she'd spent most of her adult life learning how to avoid it, or better yet, contain it before it ever spilled over. As a field officer with the Department of Critical Incident Response, her job revolved around moments that could shatter someone's life in a matter of seconds: bomb threats, coordinated attacks, breakdowns in law enforcement infrastructure, and the occasional insider meltdown that was only resolved because someone like Riley kept her head straight. She was excellent at what she did, not because she thrived on chaos, but because she refused to let it define her. She knew when to step in, and more importantly, she knew when to step back. So when Riley took temporary leave after 14 years of operating under high pressure and higher expectations, she wasn't trying to reinvent herself, escape drama, or find peace. She simply wanted quiet. Nothing existential, just quiet. She booked a 3-month rental in a gated lakeside community on the outer edge of Charleston County, South Carolina, a stretch of suburbia that looked pulled straight from a retirement brochure: pristine walkways, garden sculptures shaped like swans, porch flags changed seasonally by some invisible committee, and neighbors who smiled too wide and talked too long. It wasn't her kind of place, but that was exactly the point. Her temporary home sat on the edge of a crescent-shaped street, nestled behind trimmed hedges and a white fence that squeaked if the latch wasn't lifted just right. The house itself was modest, a 2-bedroom bungalow with wood flooring, open windows, and enough distance between properties to feel like she could breathe. There was no uniform, no duty belt, no station briefings, and for once in a very long time, no one expecting her to intervene. But Riley, being who she was, never truly clocked out. She still carried her secure walkie, the same radio device used internally by federal response units, only hers was rerouted to local emergency channels monitoring, not participating. The routine soothed her like white noise for the soul. She never transmitted, never interfered. She listened. That was all. Until Karen arrived. She met Karen during her first week, in that awkward phase when neighbors felt obligated to introduce themselves but had already formed opinions based solely on whether you waved when passing by. Karen was one of those women who projected control in every gesture. She wore pastels like armor, had short-cropped hair curled to perfection, and carried a clipboard under her arm as if it were a badge of authority. "Community liaison for our block," she said with a smile that felt more performative than warm. "We keep things orderly here. Safety first, of course. We watch out for each other." Riley gave her the kind of non-committal nod that said, "I hear you," without committing to anything more. She had no intention of joining HOA committees or attending porch brunches with strangers dissecting lawn maintenance and pet leash violations. She wasn't rude about it, just distant. A healthy kind of distant. Karen, however, didn't interpret distance as neutrality. She interpreted it as defiance. The second time they interacted, Riley had been walking the perimeter of the neighborhood near the park trails, her walkie tucked discreetly into the side pouch of her hiking bag, headphones in place, as she listened to an EMS dispatch test run from across the county. The transmission was harmless, a routine calibration, but Karen, who had materialized at the trail entrance with her grandson in tow, narrowed her eyes at the device like it was a weapon. "That's a bit much, don't you think?" she called out, gesturing toward the radio with a dramatic flair. Riley paused her playback but didn't remove the headphones. "Just listening," she said simply. "To what?" Karen asked, tone hardening under the surface of forced civility. "Police chatter? Fire calls? That's not something the average person needs to be tuned into. Especially not around children." Riley remained calm. She didn't flinch. "I'm not interfering. It's just static to most people." Karen stepped closer, her grandson no older than 10 lagging behind her, more interested in a caterpillar crawling across the sidewalk than whatever territorial war his grandmother was initiating. "That thing looks dangerous. What if it emits radiation? What if it scrambles someone's signal? Kids are sensitive to that kind of thing." Riley almost smiled, not because the statement was funny, but because it was so desperately uninformed. It's a receiver, she replied, flat, not a transmitter. Karen frowned as if the distinction was lost on her, or simply unwelcome. My grandson thinks it looks cool, like something from a spy movie. You should let him see it. Maybe even borrow it. It would make his week. Riley's face didn't change. It's not a toy. Karen blinked, then tilted her head as if trying to reassess who she was dealing with. I'm just saying you might want to be careful about walking around with things like that. Not everyone's going to be comfortable with it. I'm not looking to make people comfortable, Riley answered plainly, then offered a polite nod and continued walking. She didn't think much of it, at least not at first. There were always people like Karen in suburban communities, unofficial rule enforcers who mistook proximity for jurisdiction. Riley wasn't interested in conflict. She wasn't undercover. She was just existing quietly, intentionally, and without disruption. But the following morning, things began to change. She found a typed notice slipped into her mailbox, unsigned but marked with the neighborhood's emblem. A concerned resident has reported the presence of unauthorized communication equipment being used in shared spaces. It read, "This could interfere with emergency services and local signals. We kindly request that any such devices be discontinued to preserve public safety." Riley read it twice, the language familiar not in tone, but in tactic. It was the kind of soft censorship she'd seen before, cloaked in plausible deniability. She didn't respond. She didn't escalate. But that afternoon, she noticed someone, likely the same concerned resident, lingering near her property line. Not close enough to be accused of trespassing, just hovering. A man in his 60s with a folded newspaper under his arm and a too-casual lean against the utility box near the curb. When she stepped onto the porch, he walked away. Coincidence? Maybe. But Riley didn't rely on maybe. She repositioned her external security cam to face the front yard at a wider angle. Not for paranoia. For certainty. The walkie remained inside the house after that. Riley still listened, but only through her laptop-coded software, local feeds, nothing active. She figured the passive approach would settle things. But Karen, it seemed, wasn't interested in settling. Later that week, Riley returned home from a supply run to find the side gate ajar. Not broken, not forced, just open. The kind of open that said someone stepped through without leaving a mark. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing out of place. But the walkie, which had been resting on the side table in the screened porch, was gone. She froze. Not in fear. In evaluation. The doors were locked. The windows sealed. No security breach tripped. But the porch door, with its loose screen and slightly rusted hinge, was vulnerable. She reviewed the cam footage. Nothing. A blind spot. She didn't call 911. She didn't need to. She sat in silence, opened her laptop, and reconnected to the walkie's ID trace channel. It wasn't standard, but the device had a low-range ping setting, a feature intended for retrieval, not tracking. The moment it pulsed, she knew someone had powered it on. The signal came from 2 houses down. Riley closed the laptop and stood up. She didn't grab her badge. She didn't need to make a scene. Not yet. And that was how it began, not with a break-in or a confrontation, not with a crime worthy of headlines, but with a stolen moment of arrogance disguised as neighborly concern. A woman who believed entitlement gave her the right to cross boundaries, and another woman who'd spent her career understanding what happened when you let people believe they could. Riley didn't look for trouble, but when it knocked on her door pretending to be community spirit, she answered, and she never answered empty-handed. The walkie was sitting on the kitchen counter when Riley returned home the next evening. No note, no explanation, no apology. Just the device neatly placed, perfectly centered, wiped clean, almost staged. She stared at it for a moment, not because she was shocked, but because she understood exactly what the message was. It hadn't been a theft. It had been a statement, a power move masquerading as neighborhood concern. Someone had taken it, explored it, realized they were in over their head, and then quietly returned it like a child slipping a broken ornament back on the shelf. She powered it on. The settings had been changed barely, subtly. The output channel had been rerouted, the encryption key field cleared. Whoever had it hadn't just turned it on. They'd pushed buttons, tried to access locked fields, maybe even guessed at administrative access. They hadn't succeeded, but the attempt was enough. Riley reset the configuration, re-encrypted the signal, and then locked it behind a secondary tier she hadn't used since field duty. As the interface reinitialized, a low double beep indicated a diagnostic error, forced entry sequence detected. Not criminally actionable on its own, but highly irregular for a civilian environment. Karen's grandson Logan, she remembered now. A name tossed casually in her direction during that first passive-aggressive introduction had been fiddling with it when she passed the open window 2 days ago. At the time it seemed like innocent curiosity, but kids didn't reset channel grids or try to spoof authentication tones. That was someone else's hand. The next morning, Riley found her mailbox flagged. Not with a traditional red plastic marker, but with an actual flag bright orange, taped to the slot and folded in a triangle. She removed it, confused for a moment, until she opened the mailbox itself and found a second typed notice, this time with a slightly more aggressive tone. We've received multiple reports of suspicious behavior and unregulated equipment being carried through common areas. As this is a shared community committed to safety and harmony, any actions that disrupt peace or suggest unauthorized surveillance will be escalated accordingly. You are asked to discontinue the visible use of specialized communication devices until reviewed by the resident committee. Please note, non-compliance may result in formal intervention. Formal intervention. The phrase practically rang with bureaucratic absurdity. There was no name, no signature, just a stamped seal of the community committee, a stylized tree line overlaid with the words "Preserve integrity, ensure comfort." She folded the notice and slid it into a drawer without reacting. No one had spoken to her directly. No one had knocked. They hadn't even left a voicemail. They were building a paper trail, layering quiet allegations, manufacturing discomfort. Riley wasn't worried, she was irritated. Later that afternoon, while checking the backyard perimeter, she noticed 2 new lawn signs planted across the street. Neighborhood watch, eyes always open and report unusual activity. They hadn't been there yesterday. A coincidence, perhaps. But paired with the mail flag, the reset walkie, and the subtle channel interference she picked up earlier that morning, it painted a pattern one she'd seen too many times in civilian disputes: pressure through isolation. What they didn't understand, what Karen didn't understand, was that Riley had been trained for far worse. Whisper campaigns and passive intimidation weren't going to break her. But that didn't mean she'd stand by while people who didn't understand what they were handling tried to dictate the terms of her presence. By the time the sun set, Riley had decided to escalate the situation not by retaliating, but by documenting everything formally. She compiled timestamps, signal logs, camera footage, and even kept the returned walkie's diagnostic readout. Then, using her restricted departmental access, she issued a background-level incident report, not to spark investigation, but to register the anomaly in case things spiraled. It was an internal process. Quiet. Precise. The kind of move that didn't kick the hornet's nest but made sure everyone would remember who first disturbed the hive. The following morning, the committee email arrived. The sender was listed as Community Harmony Chairperson, but the signature at the bottom left no doubt: Karen R. Albright. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was the structural spine of this place, voted in, legitimized, weaponized through procedural bureaucracy. The email was addressed to all residents of Block C, and its tone was masterful in its indirect condemnation. It has come to our attention that recent behavior by one of our newer community members has caused concern among longtime residents. While we celebrate diversity and welcome individuals from all walks of life, we must also maintain certain standards of conduct and appearance. Devices that emit unknown signals or cause public speculation should be discouraged. We kindly ask that any unusual electronics or technical gear be left indoors and used discreetly, if at all. Let's continue to cultivate a respectful and cooperative neighborhood. The phrasing was surgical. Celebrate diversity. Unknown signals. Standards of conduct. Every word crafted to stir unease without stating the actual issue. It was a textbook smear tactic disguised as diplomacy. Riley sat at her kitchen table, sipping black coffee, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off the brushed steel finish of the now silenced walkie. She didn't feel angry. She felt confirmed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an intentional squeeze, designed to test boundaries and provoke reaction. She wouldn't give them that. Not yet. That same afternoon, she walked to the small community center near the tennis courts, a building she had deliberately avoided until now. Inside was a glass bulletin board, filled with cheerful announcements, yoga classes, bake sales, pet vaccination days. Among them, one sheet stood out, a printed flyer with a bold header: community review meeting, Block C residents only. Date and time were listed for the following Tuesday, under topics for review. The final bullet read, discuss concerns regarding radio transmissions and suspicious equipment carried near common areas. Resident presence, encouraged for transparency. Riley read the sentence twice. She wasn't just being watched. She was being set up for public judgment. The real kicker, though, came later that evening. She had just stepped onto the porch to adjust the motion light timer when a low thump echoed from the side of her property. A soft, dull noise, not loud, but unmistakably intentional. She moved quietly, stepping down the stone path to the side yard, heart calm, breath measured. There, at the edge of the lawn, sat a cardboard box. It had no markings, no return address. But the top was taped with painter's tape, the kind homeowners used for trim work and light prep. Riley crouched, inspected it without touching. Inside, neatly placed on a bed of paper towels, was an old broken baby monitor. Its antenna was missing. The front plastic was scratched, half melted. Tucked beside it, handwritten in shaky pen, was a torn sheet of notebook paper that read, "If you need to spy on people, use this instead." She stood, eyes narrowed, then picked up the box and walked back into the house. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't exaggeration. This was someone trying to provoke her into making a mistake, to lash out, to lose composure, to give them ammunition. And it was clumsy, too clumsy. The kind of move someone makes when they think they're clever but forget that surveillance isn't about visibility, it's about timing. Riley logged everything. She added photos. She included the note. She submitted an escalation addendum to her earlier report. Not to scare anyone, just to cover every angle. Then she went back to her quiet. She cooked dinner. She cleaned the counters. She listened to the hum of local traffic signals. She watched the orange streetlight outside flicker in its usual uneven pulse. But she also placed the baby monitor box in the middle of her dining table, not as a threat, not as evidence, as a reminder. She wasn't the one being watched. They were. It began just after dawn. Riley was halfway through her second cup of coffee when the subtle chime from her walkie signaled something strange, a soft tonal deviation. Not from the standard EMS chatter or even an interference spike, but a staggered digital echo resembling a short burst packet. The kind used in low-level signal pinging. It didn't belong on the local channel. It wasn't noise either. It was directional. Someone was actively trying to initiate a link or mimic one, broadcasting a handshake protocol from close range, too close, in fact. Riley paused. It was the kind of thing most would ignore, a hiccup in the airwaves. But her fingers moved before her thoughts finished forming. She muted the channel, set the receiver to passive scan, and opened her diagnostic log. The signal was repeating at 10-minute intervals, with a pulse strength that indicated the source was within 200 feet. She stood, slow and deliberate, and scanned the layout of the cul-de-sac beyond her kitchen window. The lawn was wet with dew. The street was quiet. A blue sedan she didn't recognize was parked near the community garden with its windows cracked open. Inside, a woman appeared to be scrolling through her phone, seemingly bored. On its own, the car was innocuous. But paired with the signal targeted, recurring, it raised one very specific possibility: someone had spoofed her device. Not successfully, not technically, but enough to probe. She checked the walkie again. No changes, no breach. Just the persistence of presence, like someone knocking on a locked door and waiting to see if it opens. A test. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she took the morning slowly. She watered the front hedge, waved politely to the older couple walking their Shih Tzu, and then moved to the side yard, casually repositioning her front-facing security camera a few degrees to cover more of the street. She didn't approach the blue sedan, didn't stare, didn't make a scene. But she took a mental snapshot of the license plate just the same. The real escalation happened that afternoon. It started with a knock, sharp, purposeful, a rhythm that immediately told Riley the person on the other side of the door wasn't here to borrow sugar or make polite conversation. She opened the door to find Karen standing there, flanked by two other residents, both of whom wore the same strained expressions people used when caught in something they didn't entirely understand but didn't want to be left out of. Karen, for her part, looked triumphant. Her lips pursed in rehearsed concern. "We need to speak with you," she said, without waiting for acknowledgement. "There's been another complaint." Riley said nothing. She merely stepped aside, not to let them in, but to avoid giving them the satisfaction of a confrontation on her threshold. Karen didn't take the bait. She launched into her monologue with all the self-importance of someone who'd finally caught the moment she'd been staging for weeks. "Several residents have raised concerns," she began, "about the type of equipment you've been using around communal areas. There's confusion, fear, frankly. People have the right to know what kind of transmissions are being conducted in a neighborhood filled with children and elderly residents. We have rules, you understand." Riley met her gaze without blinking. "Which rule specifically am I violating?" Karen faltered, only slightly. "Well, it's more of a community understanding. We operate under a code of conduct. Residents agree not to engage in activities that might create an atmosphere of discomfort. And frankly, when people see military-grade hardware—" "It's not military-grade," Riley interrupted calmly. "And it hasn't left my property since the last time someone illegally removed it from my porch." That hit. One of the men behind Karen shifted awkwardly. The other cleared his throat, clearly unsure whether they were here for a confrontation or just for show. Karen, however, pressed on. "There's also the issue of surveillance," she continued. "You've been observed repositioning cameras. Some residents feel as though they're being monitored. They're welcome to stop approaching my property if they don't like being in frame," Riley replied evenly. Karen's expression tightened. "You're being hostile?" "No," Riley said. "I'm being precise." There was a long silence. The sun beat down on the porch, the heat of midday settling like a weight between them. Karen broke it with a sigh that was meant to sound diplomatic, but rang with practiced exasperation. "Look," she said, softening her tone, "no one wants this to get ugly. But we have options. Formal channels. We can bring this to the management board. We can file for mediation. There are bylaws in place." Riley nodded slowly. "You do what you think you need to do." And with that, she closed the door. Not slammed, just closed. Behind it, she breathed deep, not out of stress, but out of calculation. It was moving faster now. The pressure was being applied more overtly. They were no longer hiding behind anonymous notes or passive-aggressive emails. They wanted to draw her out, to force her into defensiveness. But Riley didn't play into traps. She set her own. That night, just past 10 p.m., a silent alert pinged from her security software. One of her cameras had captured movement near the back gate. The figure wasn't masked or hurried, in fact. They moved with surprising casualness, as if they had every right to be there. It was Karen's grandson, Logan, barefoot, holding what looked like a flashlight in one hand and something else in the other, something rectangular. A phone, maybe. He approached the porch, stepped up onto the first stair, and leaned toward the side window. Then he disappeared from frame. Riley moved fast. Not with panic, but with procedural clarity. She exited through the side entrance, staying in shadow, cutting through the hedges to intercept the path between her home and Karen's yard. She didn't have to wait long. Logan came into view seconds later, walking briskly, the light bouncing as he moved. She stepped out onto the path just enough to be seen. "Logan," she said, voice low and calm. "Where were you?" He froze. His expression wasn't frightened. It was confused. He stared at her, then back at the flashlight. "I was looking for frogs," he mumbled. "I saw one earlier." "At night? At someone else's house?" she asked. He hesitated. "I just wanted to look at the walkie again. It lit up yesterday. It made a sound." Riley kept her tone neutral. "Who told you to do that?" He didn't answer. "Go home," she said. He ran. The next morning, a formal letter arrived, this time via certified envelope, slipped under the door. It was an official complaint from the Residential Oversight Board, citing allegations of targeted intimidation of a minor and unauthorized surveillance installations. The language was severe, the kind that's meant to provoke panic. A scheduled hearing was proposed. Riley knew it wouldn't hold legal weight, but the purpose wasn't legality. It was theater. That afternoon, Riley made her own call, not to the local police, and not to her old department either. She contacted a private liaison with the federal communications agency she'd worked alongside in her career. She didn't give names, just outlined the technical anomalies, the tampering, the spoof attempt, and the proximity of a child to restricted tech. The voice on the other end didn't laugh. He didn't brush it off. "You document everything," he said, "and tell your neighbors to stop poking systems they don't understand." Riley thanked him and ended the call. By nightfall, another anonymous package appeared, this time wedged in her fence. A children's walkie-talkie toy. Bright green, blinking red LED ads, and taped to the side was a note. "This one's safer." Riley didn't even bring it inside. She left it on the curb. She knew what was coming next. They'd poke until something broke. But she wasn't the one bending. The hearing took place in the community room near the pool house, a space usually reserved for wine tastings and birthday parties, but now repurposed for something resembling neighborhood arbitration. Riley entered without performance or posturing. She wore jeans, a light jacket, and carried a folder, not a briefcase, not a laptop bag, just a plain folder containing what she knew would be more than enough. The room was half full. Karen sat at the end of the table, flanked by two members of the Residential Oversight Board who wore the tired, tight-lipped expressions of people who'd been dragged into something petty but now couldn't retreat without looking weak. A few other residents filled the folding chairs, most of them curious, not hostile, at least not openly. There were no nameplates, no gavel, just awkward formality. One of the board members began with a few lines about community values and cooperation, about the importance of respecting shared spaces and avoiding actions that might generate discomfort or concern. Then Karen spoke. Her tone was restrained, almost syrupy, carefully rehearsed to sound reasonable rather than accusatory. She described the walkie as tactical equipment, claimed her grandson had experienced psychological distress. After a mysterious noise came from the device and referenced escalating behavior on Riley's part, cameras pointed at homes, whispered conversations about government surveillance, the feeling of being monitored. Riley let her speak. She didn't interrupt. She didn't frown. She sat completely still, letting the version of reality Karen was weaving stretch thin like a rope pulled too tight. When the floor was turned over to her, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She began with the facts. She laid out the device's specifications: passive receiver, encrypted, frequency locked, incapable of broadcasting on any commercial or civilian bands. She referenced the return of the walkie to her kitchen counter without explanation, the diagnostic log proving it had been tampered with, the repeated signal pings from within the neighborhood that mirrored a spoofing attempt. She presented the anonymous notes, the packages, the photographs of the child on her porch, the footage of Karen herself approaching Riley's property line multiple times in the evenings, standing there for several minutes and walking away without knocking. She showed the timestamps. She showed the metadata. She showed it all without once identifying herself by title or occupation. Then she closed the folder. The silence in the room shifted. What had begun as a concerned neighbor narrative was now hanging in the air like smoke after a misfired engine. The board members exchanged glances uncertain, caught between social loyalty and the sharp weight of formal proof. One of them asked if she had brought any form of technical authentication to verify her claims. Riley handed over a printed statement from the communications hardware manufacturer and a letter from a private compliance liaison stating the device posed zero risk and was operating within legal use limits. She said nothing about her background, her access level, or the fact that the letter had been generated within 48 hours by a contact who owed her nothing but respected her record. Karen attempted to recover. She questioned the intimidating posture of the footage, the deliberate surveillance atmosphere Riley's home created, and the frightening tone of the device when it powered on. Riley didn't answer. The board did. They thanked both parties and said they would review the documentation. No vote was cast. No conclusion was drawn. But the shift had already happened. On her way out, Riley passed a pair of neighbors near the entrance who'd kept to themselves the entire time. One of them, a woman with gray hair pulled into a bun and garden gloves sticking out of her purse, gave a quiet nod. Not allegiance, not pity, just recognition. That was enough. The following days were quiet in the way that warned you something was winding back, not winding down. Karen had gone from bold to invisible. Her curtains remained closed. The casual traffic near Riley's lawn dog walkers, joggers, meandering retirees began avoiding the front hedge altogether, making a noticeable arc around the property, as if crossing some invisible threshold would mark them for suspicion. No more notes appeared, no new packages. But it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like recalculation. Riley didn't relax. She maintained her schedule, checked her systems, monitored the channels. At one point, she picked up a brief frequency burst in the middle of the night, a mimic tone too unstable to belong to any sanctioned device, and logged it. When she scanned the feed again, it was gone. She made note of it, filed it, archived it. She didn't follow it. Not yet. She also began walking further out, past the limits of the gated sector into the buffer zones that bordered the older parts of the residential development. There she found subtle evidence of changes in the community, not tied to her present signs of internal rifts that had nothing to do with radios or electronics. A rusting gate lock that had been replaced with a keypad entry. A posted list of common area violations added to the maintenance shed. Rumors among residents about new fees, withdrawn amenities, increased scrutiny for minor infractions. It wasn't just her. The neighborhood had been tightening in general. Karen wasn't an outlier. She was a lever. That understanding made things clearer. She wasn't the target. She was the excuse. Someone had needed a trigger to push a stricter agenda, new surveillance policies, control over who used what devices, reshaping the perception of what a resident could and couldn't do on their own property. Riley, with her quiet habits and mysterious equipment, had simply arrived at the perfect moment. But they'd picked the wrong person. She'd dealt with political posturing wrapped in neighborhood charm before. She'd watched how small leaders weaponized fear to enforce their preferences. She knew what came next, documentation masquerading as concern, a sudden rewrite of rules, and manufactured consensus used to justify silencing dissent. And she knew the antidote wasn't panic or protest. It was precision. She logged it all. And she waited. The first sign that things were shifting again came not from a confrontation but from a gap. A subtle absence. Riley noticed that the board's weekly bulletin, which had always been posted every Friday on the community room door, was missing. No announcement, no schedule, no summary of ongoing initiatives. For most, it was a small oversight. For Riley, it was deliberate. Because when systems that pride themselves on routine suddenly become quiet, it isn't a sign of stability. It's a warning. She waited. Not passively, not nervously. She simply adjusted. Surveillance angles tightened. Documenting protocols became daily habit. She removed her walkie from plain sight entirely, not out of fear, but strategy. The illusion of withdrawal made people sloppy. It made them confident. And it worked. The second sign came 2 days later. She returned from a grocery run to find the side panel of her electrical box hanging open, one hinge bent slightly, the screws half-threaded like someone had started tampering and either rushed or got interrupted. Nothing inside had been altered, but the tampering was enough to breach the security report flag. Riley closed the panel, sealed it, documented it, and filed a maintenance claim through the management system. She knew it would draw attention, and she wanted it to. Later that evening, a black SUV she hadn't seen before pulled into the street, slowly crawling past her house. The windows were tinted darker than legal standard, and the vehicle didn't match any residence registry tags. It paused near the corner, headlights still on, then turned down the adjoining street and vanished behind a row of hedges. No crime in that. But then came the third sign. She was reviewing one of her camera feeds, one not installed for drama, but for utility, when she noticed a small light source appearing intermittently just inside the alley behind her home. It blinked at uneven intervals, barely visible unless the infrared overlay was active. Not a flashlight, not a camera flash. A signal indicator. Someone was running a sweep. Riley ran diagnostics on her own systems. Nothing had been breached, but one of her passive receivers had logged a handshake attempt from an unregistered MAC address, attempting to access the public bandwidth spectrum through interference masking. Sloppy. It hadn't come from Karen's house. It had come from somewhere closer. She expanded her scans. The device was piggybacking off a signal booster planted behind the shared tool shed equipment that wasn't part of the community's infrastructure. When she checked the shed herself the next morning, the booster was gone. Only the shadow of its placement remained, dust patterns shifted, a fine circle of compression where the weight had rested. She took a photograph, filed it. The pace changed after that. The following week, she received an official letter from the Residential Enforcement Committee, a subcommittee that had never previously been mentioned. The letter cited a clause about unpermitted electronic infrastructure and claimed that her use of private signal monitoring equipment was now under review, pending an inspection by external consultants contracted to evaluate electromagnetic stability within shared zones. There was no mention of who these consultants were. No names, no accreditations. Just a bolded line stating that continued use of unauthorized devices could result in fines or suspension of residency privileges. The timing was clear. The fabricated consultant review was a maneuver, one intended to intimidate without legal backing, hoping she'd yield under bureaucratic weight. But Riley had seen this tactic in political spaces and corporate pressure campaigns. You create a second authority, then let it absorb the blame. She responded, formally, with a certified notice of her own. She cited state-level regulation about the lawful use of private monitoring equipment on personal property, the lack of jurisdiction by residential organizations over non-transmitting devices, and requested the legal identities of any consultants being dispatched, including their clearance level for entering federally compliant communication systems. She didn't name-drop agencies. She didn't mention her credentials. She simply let the request do what it was designed to do, expose the bluff. And then, with no further warning, Karen went public. She posted a video on the community's private portal. It opened with her standing in front of a manicured lawn, holding a clipboard, her expression tight with concern and framed with just enough trembling indignation to mask performance as sincerity. She spoke of a rising pattern of intimidation, how certain residents had become agents of mistrust, and how unregulated surveillance had created fear among families. She didn't name Riley directly. She didn't have to. She said things like, "Some of us just want a safe place to raise our grandchildren, and we never agreed to be watched through military-grade cameras. And you shouldn't need credentials to feel safe in your own backyard." The video was short, under 2 minutes, but the reaction was immediate. Overnight, 2 residents canceled their shared garden membership. Another asked to move out of the group email thread. Someone removed Riley's name from the neighborhood volunteer board. A few houses down, a sign appeared on a window that read, "No surveillance zone, respect privacy." It wasn't fear. It was isolation, constructed, systematic, and executed without confrontation. But what they didn't anticipate was that Riley didn't need allies to act. She needed documentation. She needed motive. And now she had both. That weekend, while walking the edge of the development's southern trail, an area bordered by a tree line and unmaintained fencing, Riley noticed a set of small reflector discs newly embedded into the bark of a nearby pine. Not large, not obvious, but placed at perfect 90-degree angles, 4 feet off the ground. Too high for pets. Too low for street mapping. She ran her handheld scanner, nothing active. But the placement mirrored standard tactical positioning for directional sound monitoring. A third disc, partially buried in a mulch bed near the base, suggested the rest of the device had been removed. Quickly. Recently. She collected soil samples, documented the orientation, and made one call not to a superior but to an archivist she trusted. She didn't explain. She didn't speculate. She simply requested a cross-reference on common civilian applications that used that pattern of sensor placement. The response came 12 hours later. No commercial devices matched it. But a contractor used a similar layout in acoustic perimeter testing for energy companies' contracts often held by private firms with access to mapping-grade hardware. In other words, Karen hadn't just decided to harass Riley. Someone had backed her. And now they were cleaning up. That same evening, Riley's camera system flagged a series of audio anomalies, ultrasonic pulses, rhythmic, spaced evenly, cycling through non-audible ranges. It wasn't random. It was a scan. A crude one, not professionally tuned, but enough to indicate someone was trying to locate vulnerabilities in her system without crossing a line of physical intrusion. That night, Riley slept in shifts, her walkie offline, her interior sensors armed in full, and her backup systems routed through a secure private line disconnected from local infrastructure. She wasn't reacting out of fear. She was preparing. Because escalation wasn't just inevitable, it was accelerating. The following morning, a maintenance truck pulled up across the street. It bore no markings. 2 men exited, opened the rear, and began moving cable coils toward a junction box Riley knew hadn't needed service in over a year. When she approached and asked which department they were with, one of them smiled too quickly and gestured vaguely toward contract work for the board. No badges, no work order posted. She took a photo, then another. When they noticed, they didn't ask her to stop. They simply packed up the cables, loaded the truck, and left. By the end of the week, another letter arrived. It stated that a final review would be conducted soon to determine whether Riley's non-standard use of personal equipment violated the newly ratified Community Safety Ordinance. There was no ordinance, not legally, not yet, but that had never been the point. They didn't need truth. They only needed pressure. And Riley had let them think it was working. The letter announcing the final review was worded carefully, almost clinically, as if written by a legal consultant who understood just how far they could go without stepping over a line. It spoke of communal harmony and the balance between individual freedoms and neighborhood standards, but it masked something sharper beneath the surface, an ultimatum without teeth, dressed in bureaucratic politeness. Riley read it twice before folding it neatly and sliding it into the file she had been building for weeks. Every note, every fabricated complaint, every anomaly she had logged now lived inside that folder like a map of a slow, deliberate siege. The attempt to remove her wasn't random or reactive. It had become a quiet campaign of erasure. Push her far enough, strip enough small dignities, bend enough neighbors into silence, and eventually she'd leave on her own. That was the calculation. That had always been the calculation. But Karen, for all her rehearsed civility and weaponized concern, had overstepped. And this time there was a record. 3 days after the letter arrived, Riley received a call not from the management company, not from the fabricated consultant group, but from someone inside the State Communications Bureau. Her inquiry, filed weeks earlier through official, cautious channels, had triggered a cross-reference. A private security firm registered under a different name but using the same contractor ID had recently applied for clearance to conduct signal interference tests in residential zones under the pretense of infrastructure mapping. That firm, Riley now knew, had placed temporary test devices without public notice, and while the application hadn't been officially approved, they had begun implementation regardless, starting with her neighborhood. The discs she'd discovered near the tree line weren't random. The ultrasonic pulses weren't isolated. They were part of a field-level sweep designed to identify encrypted or high-bandwidth equipment usage. They weren't looking to gather data. They were looking to eliminate obstacles. The firm had since withdrawn its request, claiming internal error, but the timing matched. The devices, the SUV, the staged repairs, and the clumsy consultants had all been part of a controlled effort to sanitize the environment of untracked tech. Hers, specifically. Karen, it seemed, hadn't just invented a problem. She had partnered with people who had something to gain by silencing the only resident capable of recognizing what they were doing. Riley didn't inform anyone. She didn't call the committee, didn't confront Karen, didn't post updates or warnings to the resident portal. She waited, and then she acted. On the morning of the review, she left her home early and drove to the edge of the city, parking in a nondescript lot adjacent to a municipal building. There, she met a former colleague, someone who had transitioned from federal contract work to a compliance role within state oversight. They exchanged no pleasantries. Riley handed him the file. Inside it was everything. The spoof logs, the signal diagrams, the infrared camera footage, the legal references to equipment jurisdiction, and most important, the timeline of escalating interference matched to the firm's illegal application. He took it without a word. They parted without a handshake. Later that same afternoon, the community meeting proceeded as planned. Residents were called into the room in staggered clusters, a strategy Karen had likely suggested to create the illusion of control. Riley was seated near the back. She didn't dress to impress. She didn't carry her walkie. What she carried instead was a simple printed letter, freshly issued and bearing the seal of the bureau her former colleague now operated within. It was a cease and desist notice, directed not at her but at the board. Specifically, at the use of unlicensed contractors for signal analysis and unauthorized equipment deployment on private property. The letter did not suggest criminal charges. It did not threaten fines. It simply ordered all activity related to the so-called safety ordinance to halt, pending a formal investigation. She placed the letter at the center of the conference table without commentary. Karen, upon reading the first line, visibly paled. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes darted to the board members, who fumbled for a unified reaction. One of them asked where Riley had obtained the document. She answered calmly that it had been issued by the proper regulatory authority in response to documented overreach. Another member attempted to downplay it, suggesting that perhaps the contractors in question were acting independently. Riley didn't challenge them. She didn't have to. Because in the same envelope as the cease and desist was an attached statement, signed and notarized, confirming the submission of formal evidence to the Bureau, including internal logs pointing to board authorization. The air in the room shifted palpably. The attempt to paint her as unstable, overcautious, even paranoid crumbled in an instant. Riley had not accused. She had reported. And what she reported had been validated. Karen spoke once more, this time softer, the edge of her voice gone. She attempted to reframe her actions as concern for the vulnerable, repeating the refrain about children and seniors. Riley didn't interrupt. She let Karen finish. Then she spoke. She explained that the device in question was passive, that every piece of equipment used on her property fell within the scope of protected personal rights. She reminded the board that she had never once transmitted, never interfered with shared infrastructure, never violated any documented regulation. And then, finally, she stated clearly, without flair, that she had been a field-certified operative in critical incident response for over a decade, and that she had more knowledge of lawful communications conduct than anyone in the room. She had chosen to remain silent, chosen not to posture, chosen not to use her badge, because she had believed in letting her actions speak for themselves. But since that had failed to earn her peace, she was no longer willing to remain quiet. The board folded. They issued a statement that the review would be postponed indefinitely. The ordinance, unofficial and unratified, was dissolved. The anonymous complaints vanished from the system, erased quietly to avoid exposure. Karen said nothing more. She did not apologize. She did not defend. She simply stood, gathered her papers with shaking hands, and left. In the following days, the neighborhood settled into something resembling normalcy, though the energy had shifted. Some residents still avoided Riley. Others greeted her with a cautious respect. The cameras stayed up. The walkie returned to its place by the porch window. No more letters came. No more CVs idled down the block. The board remained intact, but its tone had changed, less authoritative, more deferential, careful now to send only notices with clear legal basis and no threatening ambiguity. Riley didn't seek celebration. She didn't relive the win or post anonymous summaries online. She returned to her routines, quiet and firm, as she had always been. She had not fought for validation. She had fought for space to exist, to observe, to be left alone. And that at last had been secured. What they hadn't understood from the beginning was this: Riley hadn't needed to prove who she was. They had only needed to be reminded that she was someone who paid attention, and now they would never forget. The final shift came not with a confrontation or another official letter, but in the smallest of details, the kind that went unnoticed by most but stood out to someone like Riley, who was trained to read patterns, to feel the air change when people stopped pretending. It began with the silence. Not the cold kind, not the watchful, gossipy hush that had lingered on her street for weeks, but a real, absolute silence, the absence of interference, of maneuvering, of passive-aggressive glances and murmured conspiracies. No one was peeking through blinds anymore. No one was hovering near her fence line. And the community bulletin, once missing or altered with carefully curated warnings, returned to its regular schedule with no mention of her or any ordinance tied to personal equipment use. Karen's home remained as it always had, neat, polished, aggressively symmetrical, but the woman herself was changed. She no longer walked the neighborhood with that unmistakable air of proprietorship, no longer offered unsolicited remarks about flower beds or lawn edges. She didn't organize events, didn't call for meetings, didn't speak at the bulletin board. Whatever standing she'd once had among the residents had been fractured, not with scandal or violence, but by exposure. Her name was never publicly dragged, her face never plastered on warnings, but she had been quietly and thoroughly disarmed. Her influence, stripped not by force but by consequence. Riley didn't gloat. She didn't nod smugly when passing Karen on the sidewalk. She simply offered the same neutral silence she had since the day they met. And in that silence, Karen finally understood that there was no restoration, no return to control. Whatever imaginary authority she'd built, whatever power she had drawn from whispers in committees and invented concern, it was gone. Not because Riley had destroyed it, but because Riley had survived it, and that survival had spoken louder than any accusation. The walkie remained by the window, though it was rarely powered on now. Riley still monitored her systems, still reviewed activity logs, still maintained the routines that made her feel anchored, but she no longer waited for escalation. She no longer braced for the next move. Because there was no next move. The campaign had failed. The narrative they tried to write around her had collapsed under the weight of its own invention. They had turned her into a symbol of suspicion, hoping she'd retreat under pressure, and instead, she'd shown them what it meant to stand still when others tried to push you into corners. Her time in the rental drew to a close, not with drama, but with quiet deliberation. She extended the lease for another term, not because she feared what might happen elsewhere, but because she liked the stillness now that it was hers. The yard had grown familiar. The late afternoon light through the screen porch had become a comfort. She planted nothing. She redecorated nothing. She simply existed. That was the point all along. When the new board election cycle arrived, Karen did not run. Her seat remained open for a time, and eventually someone else stepped into it, a mild-mannered man who asked questions instead of giving answers, who smiled like someone who genuinely didn't want to be feared. Under him, the committee simplified. Fewer rules, fewer pretenses. Just quiet maintenance and occasional updates about power outages or recycling pickups. Riley received them like everyone else. She didn't need special treatment. She just wanted what everyone else claimed to want, to be left in peace. The community, once on edge around her presence, began to forget their performance. Some apologized subtly through small gestures, nods, moments of mutual understanding over weather complaints or parking issues. Others never acknowledged it, but Riley didn't need them to. Forgiveness wasn't something she gave or withheld. It wasn't part of the deal. She had never been interested in teaching them a lesson. She had only wanted her boundary respected. And now, finally, it was. Her walk around the block each morning became routine again. She passed the same houses, the same mailboxes, the same trimmed lawns, but none of it felt like enemy territory anymore. It simply was what it was, suburbia, in all its contradictions and quiet power games. She no longer felt like an outsider pretending not to notice the undercurrent. She had become something else entirely, not feared, not followed, just known. And in a place like this, that was more powerful than being liked. The raindrops on the roof one night reminded her of field nights on patrol years ago, when all she had was gear and instinct, and the constant sense that something might go wrong if she blinked at the wrong time. But here, in this house, under this roof, she let herself blink. She allowed silence to mean peace, not threat. She allowed stillness to be earned, not defended. The final file, she kept the one with all the documentation, photos, dates, and audio logs, was encrypted and uploaded to an off-site drive. She didn't keep it out of paranoia. She kept it out of principle. The same way a builder keeps blueprints after the house is finished. Not because they plan to rebuild, but because they remember what it took to make it stand. And that was the end of it. No twists, no reprisals, no final blow from a cornered antagonist. Just clarity. Riley didn't win anything. She didn't have to. Because no one took what was hers.